I'm ready. Got it. Okay. Uh, Locke's second treatise of government is one of the most important social contractarian texts of the Enlightenment. It's a landmark in political philosophy, and for better or worse, it's been enormously influential. Uh, he's he is in the American tradition, in some ways, what Montesquieu is in the European tradition. Both of them are the kind of baseline for enlightened political thought. Locke's second treatise was published in 1689, the same time as the Glorious Revolution, which was a bloodless palace coup, which drove out a Catholic monarch and brought in William and Mary of Orange from Holland to be the king and queen of England. So compared to the English Revolution of 1640 to 60, it's a much more glorious revolution. There's something to be said for that, because it didn't involve mass extermination. And it settled the position of the English monarchy. And Locke was, in a way, writing a text that would justify this change. Remember that the right to rebellion is not, generally speaking, one which has been an important element up to now in the Western political tradition. If you remember back in the ancient and medieval political tradition, authority comes from top down, and that's what makes legitimate government, that the king or the monarch or the sovereign has some justification from on high. If that's the case, then rebelling against the government is the same thing as rebelling against God or whatever it is that's authorizing the king. And what that means is that there's no right to rebellion. There's also no right to criticize the government. So what Locke is going to introduce is the right of rebellion. And this is a very tricky idea, of course, because once you give people the right to rebellion and the capacity to make legitimate revolution, it also renders any government somewhat uncertain. In other words, this would have been Hobbes's objection. He said, look, if you give people the right to rebellion, they'll rebel whenever they're angry, and what they'll get is a state of nature, or a state of war of all against all, all against all, which is worse than the simple oppression that you get in ordinary governments. Locke has a somewhat more optimistic view of human nature. In a way, it's hard not to have a more optimistic view of human nature than Hobbes, because he's just so dark and rather misanthropic. So Locke wants to establish the idea that the people legitimate the government by the consent of the governed. And when the government no longer has that consent, the people have a right to alter or abolish that government. These sentiments are going to be seen in Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, for example. All right. Now, it's sometimes, students ask, why do we read the second treatise of government, but no one touches upon the first? Well, the first was a kind of line by line, paragraph by paragraph refutation of the political theory of Sir Robert Filmer. And Robert Filmer derived all legitimate political authority from God, and God giving political authority to Adam. So for him, it goes all the way back to the mythic beginnings of the Bible. And so he saw government as essentially an extension of patriarchal authority. And that's an extension of God's choices about how to organize human society. Locke did a pretty good job of refuting this, but since now almost nobody believes in the kind of political theory that Filmer advocated, nobody bothers to read the first treatise. Now, the second treatise is more constructive. If political legitimacy doesn't come from God, and if it's not a top-down great chain of being kind of structure, what is the source of political legitimacy, and how does his account differ from Hobbes? So both Hobbes and Locke are social contractarians. So Rousseau will also be a little bit later. And these three social contractarian theorists argue that political legitimacy comes from the bottom up. A natural man in the state of nature all decide to give up some of their natural liberties to the government. And in Locke's case, they give up their natural liberties, or at least some of them, in order to secure themselves from the inevitable evils that emerge in the state of nature. Now, it's important to realize that Hobbes' state of nature is much more bleak and much more misanthropic than Locke. Locke believes in something like Aquinas's natural law. In other words, when people are in the pre-political state, it's not the war of all against all. That's very unusual and anomalous. It happens, but it doesn't happen all the time. He said, Locke says that families are natural, which seems like a plausible enough idea. That human passions drive together males and females, they have sex, they reproduce, and mostly they don't make war on their children, because otherwise there'd be no people. In fact, they do their best to provide for their children. And the children are in a state of less than perfect autonomy while they're growing up. Once they get to be of age, then they're autonomous equals with their parents. All right, so legitimacy comes from consent. And the reason why people form the social contract, according to Locke, is in some ways embedded in Christian theology. No matter how powerful natural moral law is, inevitably there's a fly in the ointment. There's some joker in every crowd that's going to kill or murder or dispossess other people. And the well-behaved portion of society, which is always the majority, needs to band together to prevent these evils from emerging, or at least from being continued. So there are natural moral laws in the state of nature, which Hobbes denies. And also there are natural rights in the state of nature. Remember that Hobbes says in the state of nature, it's a free-for-all. There is no moral order. There's just big fish eating little fish. For Locke, people are naturally sociable as well as unsociable. And actually, that's a much more realistic account of human nature. It's not typical for human beings to kill their children. The natural rights which Locke believes people have are a right to life, and from life, he'll have other subsidiary rights, a life to liberty, a right to property or possessions, and also a right to health. In other words, other people don't have the right to kill you, but they also don't have the right to harm you, say wound you. And in addition, other people don't have the right to imprison you in a cave or some such. And they also don't have the right to deprive you of the possessions that make life possible. So you have to remember that when Locke talks about property, he's not just talking about fish that you might catch in a lake or deer that you might hunt in a forest. He's also talking about things like air. Right? You need to have air. And since there's plenty of it, everyone has a natural right to as much air as they want or as they need. And no one has the right to deprive them of that. So he has a very extended idea of property. And Locke is very important for the political theory, that informs later developments in economics. Here's what happens. Locke proposes a labor theory of value. In other words, what that means is that the amount of value that a thing has is directly proportionate to the amount of labor that goes into it. So what that means is that things that are very laborious to obtain end up having a high cost. Things that are not laborious to obtain, like air, for example, those have a low cost. No one has ever charged anybody else for air, right? But they do charge other people for diamonds because diamonds are hard to find. So because human beings are naturally imperfect, there's always someone who violates the natural moral code. And this is what drives rational people to give up some portion of their autonomy to create a state, and the government that they create is contingent upon protecting life, liberty, and property. If it fails to do those things, then Locke says they have a right to rebellion. And this is a very important thought because the age of the Enlightenment is an age characterized by political revolution. In other words, this is the point, the turning point in Western culture when authoritarian governments are replaced by governments based upon the consent of the governed. The divine right absolutism of both English and French kings falls out of favor. And instead, the idea of a constitutional monarchy, a monarchy with limits that's not absolute, is what replaces the older tradition of monarchy in England, for example. So that's what we get in the Glorious Revolution. We get a limited monarchy, which is still there, but doesn't have absolute power the way some English kings and also Hobbes thought that they ought to. Now, the purpose of government is to protect life, liberty, and property, and it requires the consent of the governed. And what this is going to do is going to cause a number of uncertainties and ambiguities when it comes to war. Now, Hobbes is very easy to integrate with the idea of war because so much of his political philosophy hinges on violence, legitimate or illegitimate. War is going to be a problem for Locke because it's a fact of human history, and it's going to be connected with the institution of slavery. And slavery is, of course, a very big issue because the British government is heavily invested, and the British society is heavily invested in the transatlantic slave trade. Now, before Locke wrote the second treatise, he wrote the Constitution of South Carolina, which would be 1669, and he worked on that for his boss, the Earl of Shaftesbury. And there he included not only slavery, but something like medieval serfdom. And so he had a hierarchy of statuses, and he didn't have at that point in his thinking an idea, or at least he didn't make reference to an idea of the social contract. And there's a tremendous tension here because he was writing on behalf of his boss, his patron. And in the case of the constitutions of South Carolina, he most likely was required to write what the boss wanted rather than writing what his own opinions were. And yet he could have perhaps had a back and forth with his patron, and it might have turned out differently. And you remember that South Carolina was the most pro-slavery, pro-secessionist state in the Union in 1860. It led the secession movement and the pro-slavery movement, and that's what generated the American Civil War. So Locke's influence is both theoretical and practical in the American political tradition. And most Americans, when they read Locke, find his views easy to absorb because Lockean political philosophy is powerfully implicated in the American political tradition. When Thomas Jefferson writes, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." This is pretty much straight Lockean thinking, but it's been tinkered with by Benjamin Franklin. So in the first part, where Jefferson says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that was actually changed by Franklin. What Jefferson originally wrote was, we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. And that's a little bit on the religious side for old Ben Franklin. So he decided to call them self-evident instead. In other words, he's analogizing them more to Euclid than the Ten Commandments. Now, just parenthetically, something you should think about, whenever people tell you that some proposition X is self-evident, what that usually means is that the speaker and lots of other people believe it, but they've forgotten why, and no one knows how to explain why. All right, so be a little careful about the idea of self-evident. As Aquinas says, some things are only self-evident to the wise, and the number of things that are claimed to be self-evident certainly includes a number of things which are contradictory with each other. So just be a little careful about the idea of self-evidence. But we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Human equality is an assumption built into the idea of the social contract, because in the state of nature, everybody's naturally equal and everybody naturally has rights. And Locke is usually described as a philosopher of possessive individualism. And the idea is something like this. Americans will find this very intuitive, and maybe more than Americans will. If you're living in the state of nature and you and your family have a little place where you live, that place belongs to you if you created it. So if you gathered the materials and you put the work in, here's the labor theory of value, then the house or the hut that gets created belongs to you. Provided always that you haven't taken away all of such resources and denied them to other people, and also provided that the resources that are left are just as good. Let me give you an example. If you go into the forest and you hunt a deer, the venison belongs to the hunter. All right. For those of you that know the political philosophy of Rawls, later on he's going to make the argument that no, the venison belongs to everybody. And I won't go into that argument now, but many people find that counterintuitive. If you were to go fishing on a pier and you catch a fish, most people are inclined to believe that the fisherman who catches it owns the fish. A more socialist view of property would say, no, the fish is common property. And that is at variance with the individualism of Locke. So Locke says that if you impose work on nature, the resulting goods that you get from that, like picking apples off a tree, belong to you. But you're not allowed to pick all the apples off all the trees. And also you're not allowed to take so much that it will spoil, because there's a universal right to the goods of nature. And everyone is entitled to use their labor to get what they need to live, but they're not allowed to deny that to their neighbors, either by taking it all or by taking so much that it spoils. Plausible enough idea. Now, Locke is also going to say that when gold and silver are discovered, for the first time then it becomes possible to accumulate wealth in a non-spoilable form, which means that the previous limit on the idea is that you're only allowed to bring home so many fish as you can use. If you bring home many more fish than you can use and the fish rot, then you don't have a right to the property in those fish beyond what you can actually use. You're not allowed to let things spoil. Well, when we have the possibility of exchanging fish or venison or apples for gold and silver, then it becomes possible to accumulate wealth in a non-spoilable form. And that means that a greater degree of inequality is not only allowed, but is part of the natural law of property, because that constraint no longer applies. Now, in a way, or some have argued that Locke is arguing in favor of the kind of economic disparities characteristic of England in his own time. The Puritans had won the Puritan Revolution. They were largely taken from an urban trading class, and they had established the right of private property and also the right of parliamentary supremacy. And what Locke is doing is providing a political theory which will justify the people, understood as those who were members of parliament and those who could vote for parliamentary representation, and also the right of property that that includes inequality of a much greater degree than is found in the state of nature. Now, there are other difficulties with Locke. Locke says that slavery is not a legitimate social relation because it violates the idea of the social contract. And even if someone were to be made a prisoner in a war and give up their freedom in exchange for their lives, Locke would say that's not a legitimate relationship of power because it's not voluntary. And even if there is some justice in allowing people to be taken into slavery as a result of war, certainly that couldn't possibly apply to their children because they weren't taken in the case of war. So Locke is kind of stuck. He's interested in practical politics, and he's also interested in writing a political theory that will gain wide acceptance. But his prejudice, and I don't mean this in a bad sense, his prejudice towards freedom is hard to square with his practical reinforcement of the society in which he lives. The sovereign, unlike in the case of Hobbes, is going to be subject to the law. Remember that Hobbes's sovereign is above the law because he creates the law. And that means that the consent of the majority or the consent of the ruled is going to determine the legitimacy of the government. But here's another ambiguity that is not easy to put together. Hobbes says that the people shall judge whether the government is holding up their end of the social contract by properly protecting people's natural rights. And the problem emerges when we ask who the people are. There's never been a revolution in the history of the world in which 100% of those governed decided simultaneously to cash in the government. Inevitably, revolutions are created by some fraction of society. Well, the question is, does a fraction of society have the right to impose a revolution on the remainder of society? Is it a question of majorities? How do you count these majorities? If it's not a question of majorities, then how do you know who you're going to include in the people? Will the people be adult males? Will it be white males? Will it be adults, both male and female? He doesn't exactly explain who the people are. It's a very stirring call to arms, and it was very influential among those who made the American Revolution. But a good bit of its popularity comes from the fact that it has certain strategic ambiguities built into it. So this conception of human nature leads to a particular conception of political legitimacy, and it had a powerful influence on the age of revolution, in particular on the American Revolution. It was invoked by the revolutionaries in America, saying that we want the same rights that Englishmen have already been acknowledged to have, not only by Locke, but by other writers who claimed that rebellion was legitimate when the people were not given the opportunity to choose their government and to decide whether it was meeting the ends that are proper to government. Now, for those of you that like or are interested in the connection between art and politics, I would recommend to you a novel by someone who read the second treatise and liked Locke's ideas very much, and that'd be Daniel Defoe. Robinson Crusoe is, in fact, a recapitulation of particularly Locke, but more generally, Enlightened political theory and the Enlightenment conception of history. Remember that we start with just Robinson Crusoe on an island, and he gets thrown there, and his first job is to establish the things he needs to survive. So he needs to get food and water and shelter and protect himself from dangers that might exist outside his immediate understanding or his immediate view. And what he does is keep a ledger. Now, there's something terribly English about the idea of keeping a ledger when you're the only person on an island. But what the ledger does is describe what he's getting, in other words, what he's using work on. And the ledger doesn't use money because there's no money there. The ledger is kept in terms of time spent working. So what Defoe is doing is introducing the labor theory of value into Robinson Crusoe's bookkeeping. Robinson Crusoe goes back to the ship and brings many useful tools that he uses to make his life better. The ship represents the Western intellectual tradition, and what he's doing is taking those tools to bring to himself so that he can work more effectively and protect his life, liberty, and property. There's not much danger of his property being taken until he discovers the cannibals who are there and shoots them. And then, of course, Friday, the cannibal or the indigenous American that was going to be killed, comes and expresses his desire to be Crusoe's slave, or if not his slave, perhaps something like his butler. He wants to be a subaltern. And this is a fairly Lockean idea. There's some uncertainty as to how Crusoe should treat Friday, but he and Friday work together to make the island more habitable and more advantageous to them. And Crusoe goes through all the phases of historical development, from primitive hunting to eventually agriculture to the domestication of animals. And he goes all the way up until Europeans get shipwrecked there. And by then he's in the Enlightenment. One of the Europeans that's shipwrecked is a Catholic, a Spaniard, and he decides that in his kingdom, because he's the sovereign, that he's going to extend religious toleration. And you have to remember that Locke wrote a book, an essay called A Letter Concerning Toleration, in which he said, let's dispense with the conflicts over religion that characterized the Reformation. These were bloody and violent and counterproductive. Let's extend religious toleration to everyone that's willing to extend religious toleration to other people. So what we see in Defoe's Robinson Crusoe is the Lockean conception of human nature and the Enlightenment conception of human history realized in fictional form. So Locke has proved extremely important and extremely influential in developing a set of ideas which were invoked by various enlightened political thinkers. And the ones that came later generally radicalized Locke. Rousseau has a much more radical version of the social contract, and that was far more important in the French Revolution than Locke was. But for the American Revolution, Locke is the man to go to. If you're studying American history, knowing Locke's second treatise is indispensable. Now, Jefferson said that the three most important thinkers in the history of the world, in his estimation, were Bacon, Locke, and Newton. And that's a very high compliment. Francis Bacon is the one who established the scientific method and the process of systemic experimentation. And that was very important for the scientific revolution. He and Descartes were the two key figures in developing the rise of modern natural science. Newton, of course, is the one who created Newtonian mechanics, who gave us a mathematical formalization of the motion of all bodies. And that, of course, was in some ways the capstone or the keystone in the arch of Enlightenment science. But Locke was an application of Enlightenment science to the political world. Remember that the connection between politics and science is intimate. Whenever you see the American founders, the Federalists, people like John Adams, for example, talking about a balance of powers, right? What he's doing is invoking one of the ideas or one of the images of Newtonian mechanics, where the various planets revolving around the sun are held in balance, all right, by each other. And this idea of balance is what we're going to get in Locke and what we're going to get in the American Federalists. There's a dynamic equilibrium between the people and the government. And the idea that the Federalists were trying to realize is a homeostatic equilibrium in which one portion of the government would bring other portions of the government back into line by having this separation of powers. Now, this is completely foreign to someone like Hobbes. Hobbes says, no, you have to have one source of authority, and it has to be as terrifying as possible, because if it has any weakness at all, and if there's any limitation to it, that threatens to drive us back into the state of nature. Locke says, well, driving us back into the state of nature, at least for a short time, by itself isn't all that bad, because even in the state of nature, natural moral law applies. So if you have that rather more optimistic view of human nature, then the possibility of reverting back temporarily to a state of nature and then reconstructing government and reconstructing sovereignty on the basis of that makes a considerably greater degree of sense. So if there were three people in the Enlightenment, three political thinkers in the Enlightenment that were crucial to the development of representative government and the demise of monarchy, or the erosion of monarchy, perhaps is better, that would be Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau. Hobbes is the first iteration of social contractarianism, and he has a very limited, very truncated view of what human rights are, right? You have the rights that nature prevents you from not exercising. So it has a very limited scope. For Locke, the set of human rights is considerably larger, and it's based upon individual work and individual initiative. It also retains sovereignty in the people, and these rights are, as Jefferson put it in the Declaration, inalienable. So you can't give these up because they inhere in the body politic, not just in the sovereign. And Rousseau is going to extend this social contractarianism towards a much more radical egalitarian vision of politics. And if you get a chance, if you read his Discourse on the Origins of Inequality, Rousseau is going to treat inequality as unnatural, and he's going to see property in land as being the source of the illegitimate human inequality that characterized France during the Ancien regime. So he's going to take Locke's natural inequality and reduce that greatly, so that inequality is in fact a usurpation of the original pristine equality that all people had intrinsically. That's part of the reason why the French Revolution was so much more radical than the American Revolution. Much of the Lockean political theory was consistent with what America already had. It had a commercial elite. It had slavery. It had stratification based on wealth. And Locke legitimated that. Rousseau, on the other hand, called into question things like inequality of property and inequality of rights. And this is a much more radical view of the social contract. and of the intrinsic equality of all human beings. By implication, this should extend to women, and this should also extend to non-Europeans. Everybody has this set of rights as a precondition for being human beings. So what the French Revolution is going to give us, in the spirit of Rousseau, is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And this is going to be completely universal in a way that the American, say, the Bill of Rights, is not universal. It's local. It applies locally to a particular group of people, and it doesn't make any cosmic legislation and doesn't speculate about how far this can go. Now, a big part of this is the fact that America is stuck with slavery, and that was the fly in the ointment for the American Constitution. The majority of the American Federalists wanted to get rid of slavery, but there was a small group, particularly in South Carolina and also in Georgia, and a few in the Tidewater of Virginia, that were not willing to do that. And in order to make the Constitution of 1789 work, the anti-slavery majority caved in and made a deal with the pro-slavery segment in the lower South, and that's where you get things like the 3/5 compromise, and things like the provision that the slave trade would be ended in 1808. It's worth noting that the word slave never gets used in the American Constitution because they were very uneasy about it, and they fudged it because they didn't have any choice. If they didn't find a way to reconcile the Southern demand for slavery, then they would not have been able to unify the US. And if they hadn't got a unified US, American history would have been enormously different, particularly because when the Louisiana Purchase gets made from Napoleon, he would not have sold it to the Anglophile North. He would have sold Louisiana to the slaveholding South, in which case the slaveholding South would have held all the cards in terms of political power, and that means military power in North America. So the Americans punted, and they didn't want to make a decision, and that's a kind of Lockean practicality. Fuzziness has both its virtues and its vices. The downside, of course, was that you couldn't fudge it forever. And eventually, by 1860, Americans fought a war over slavery, and it was also a war to decide whether government is really Lockean, in the sense of voluntary compact, or if it's really Hobbesian, in which case the sovereign cannot be disputed successfully. And it turns out that the North wins, and that Hobbesian political philosophy supersedes Lockean political philosophy. Why? Because the federal government established its permanent supremacy, and no one's going to successfully walk away from that now. So Locke is a very interesting read. He's also a rather easy read compared to the long, drawn-out writings of Hobbes and the rather poetic and extravagant writing of Rousseau. It will repay a close reading, and you should consider him as a kind of bridge between the early Enlightenment thinking of Hobbes, which hasn't fully worked out the implications of the social contract, and the late Enlightenment final stage of social contractarianism, which we get in Rousseau. He is the kind of thinker that deserves careful reading, and you should be aware that he's not so much looking for logical coherence as he is looking for practical utility.